We can now hear from Sreeram Chaulia, Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs. Thanks for joining us, sir. This attack comes after just a week or two after the tragic events in Manchester, indeed after the Westminster attack as well. Tragically, could we expect more attacks to come after this?
Daniel, this is the fasting season of Ramadan, and jihadist mindset, if you understand it and if you penetrate it, you will see that they have a notion that they will earn place in paradise if they conduct more attacks during the fasting season. So Europe has been ravaged by this menace for a couple of years now, and Britain itself, as you said, has been attacked 3 to 4 times lately. It is, in fact, looks like it's a wolf pack kind of attack, because there are at least 3 or 4 potential assailants involved in this. And from the pictures circulating, it is clear that this is a jihadist strike. And this is a terrorist attack. And it also shows that there is a serious problem of radicalization of some of the British Muslims. And I don't think this can be, swept aside, because really, if you look at it, the British government announced last year that there were nearly 400 or more ISIS returnees from Syria who have come back into Britain. And then there are at least 3,500 suspected ISIS-inspired or ISIS-coordinated cells, individuals, parts of cells who are being monitored. And then there are some, like the Libyan attacker in Manchester, who had been dropped off the monitoring even though he was suspected. So if you look at all these things together, there is a serious problem of radicalization, and I think it's a political message the terrorists are trying to send here. They're saying Britain is involved in anti-ISIS operations, at least since 2014. They had something called Operation Shader, which was the start of a British effort to counter ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, and as well as in Libya. So now we are seeing in many ways the kind of a blowback effect of this, because the terrorists believe that they have to strike at the heart of Britain, at the civil society, at the ordinary people who are having a good time on the evening, to try and force the British government to change its policies and to rescind its counter-terrorism approach in the Middle East.
And just on the subject of blowback from foreign policy, that's been quite a controversial topic, hasn't it, in the wake of the Manchester bombing? Jeremy Corbyn made at least some connection, some link between the heightened terror threat to the UK and the overseas military interventions. He's been roundly criticised by people saying this is nothing to do with that. This is a poisonous ideology spread by people who carry this out because they hate our way of life, because they want to destroy the West as they see it. The answer is probably somewhere in between those 2 points of view, isn't it?
That's right, Daniel. I mean, the motivation is clearly political, but the modus operandi is based on religious fundamentalism and fanaticism. So it is a combination of the two. It is not possible for people to turn into suicide bombers and to come out with knives and to slit throats. Apparently, that's what has been happening in London last night. So if you look at all this, this amount of barbarism and dehumanization of the other cannot happen without poisonous ideological, brainwashing of young people, either on the internet or through the method of returnees coming back from the Middle East after being recruited. And if you see, Britain, one of the first big public faces of ISIS that emerged actually happened to be British. It was the so-called Jihadi John. And this has become infectious, among some disgruntled young people. Britain has more than 3 million people of Muslim origin, which is about 5% of the population. And even if minuscule percentage of them are bitten by this virus, it's enough to spread this. So yes, there is fanaticism involved. A lot of them believe that this is a clash of civilizations, that the Western nations are crusaders and are coming and occupying Muslim lands, and they need to be pushed back. So that is very much there. And I think if it is coordinated by ISIS, They have an overseas operations cell, which Adnani used to head until he was killed. I think if that is the case, then we'll have to look at clear political motivations. If not, they're simply venting frustration at the so-called crusaders. And remember, this is infectious. And what happens is that one leads to other, and then the next. And until and unless Britain really takes charge of the radicalization problem, there are lots of policies as well as academic research going on in the UK about radicalization. But unfortunately, what seems to be the case is many are slipping through the radar. And in many ways, it's a call for us to think closer about counterterrorism and policing and community level policing. Why are ordinary British Muslims staying quiet even if they notice something untoward happening? To what extent is there coordination between the police and informants on the ground? All these need to be relooked. And you're right, Jeremy Corbyn, the politics is also unfortunately coming in the way now. They have a general election coming up in less than 10 days. And in this kind of atmosphere, I think it looks like the jihadists have decided that they need to up the tempo to try and impact on the election results in one way or the other, and to make a point that, we will keep on doing this until and unless Britain stops the what they consider to be the assaults on their fighters in Syria and Iraq.
Mm. And of course, you speak of British Muslims, but of course, this isn't a problem that's isolated to the UK, is it? This fits in with a bit of a pattern in Europe. We've seen the same modus operandi in France, in particular in Germany as well. We've covered many of the attacks. I've covered many of the attacks here personally in the studio as well. Of course, it'll be oversimplifying perhaps to lump every single terror attack in every country under the same umbrella. But really, is this part of a wider pattern of perhaps disillusion, disenfranchisement, whatever it is happening to Muslim communities across Europe as well, that is feeding in to these sorts of attacks?
Yes, Daniel. In fact, the continental Europeans have an even worse record than Britain in terms of integration and multicultural intermixing and all that. There is also the hatred of Muslims, which we call Islamophobia, which also feeds into all this, because it's like a self-reinforcing death spiral. What happens is that these attacks happen, and then it increases the anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment in the society, and that creates further barriers. So in a way, the terrorists succeed by doing these attacks because they want to increase the cleavage in these societies, in European societies. And France especially has been so vulnerable, and we've seen it so often, Belgium, and even Germany. So Britain, has been relatively more successful than these other countries in absorbing Muslims over decades. But there are pockets, as I said, where young people are, keyed into radical preachers. There are a number of them in mosques who are, of course, monitored by the police and intelligence services, and yet are able to connect young people to give them a so-called calling or a purpose in life. So if they feel like they have achieved nothing and they're nobodies, suddenly they are told that, if you go out and achieve martyrdom, then you will be, doing God's work and also earning piety. So I think we have to challenge all this in a big way. Already there are programs in the UK to try and de-radicalize young people with the involvement of moderate Muslims. But Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, is a moderate Muslim, and his election was hailed as a breakthrough in terms of multiculturalism. But here you go, in the heart of London, in Sadiq Khan's London, you have young people like this going berserk and killing innocents.
And Sadiq Khan, perhaps quite controversially, said that terror attacks were part and parcel of living in a big city. That was a quote which attracted quite a bit of criticism from some quarters, and clearly the government will be under pressure after yet another attack to take action, especially in the wake of the general election. What form could that action take, though? Could we see more surveillance powers pushed through, the threat level increased, more armed police on the streets? We've already seen special units created, of course, counter-terror, heavily armed units. Could we see them increased? What sort of reaction do you expect from the UK government to this?
Well, Theresa May was a former Home Secretary, and she was in charge of all the internal security for many years before becoming Prime Minister. So she knows what levers and tools she has as the Prime Minister to be able to mount a serious security operation over an extended period of time. There are, situations like these where emergencies, where police and intelligence will have to take on greater powers and to be able to weed out some of these elements who are taking shelter within non-violent communities and abusing the hospitality of moderate Muslims. So we have to actually, I think the ultimate goal should be to isolate these terrorists and radicals and to not let them have safe haven. In the UK, in some areas where these have become like no-go territories. So I think we have to increase, and also I think at one level the schooling that happens, and even family, what's happening within homes, travel patterns. I think they have to be really, really cautious, looking at where people are flying and where they are traveling to and who they are meeting. In a way, it requires not just domestic surveillance, but international intelligence cooperation. Because as we saw with the Manchester attack, the killer had been to Libya a few months ago and had returned, and he had been on the watch list but then had dropped off. I think there's also a question of limited resources. Many people believe that there isn't enough intelligence activity and tailing of terrorists as they should be, because they are so consumed with so many suspects. So in a way, although there is heavy surveillance and Britain has lots of CCTVs and all these things, nonetheless, in private homes, in neighborhoods, these things are happening. So one is the state has to obviously go after them, and root them out, because now it seems like the cycle that maybe they had stopped in 2005 when the London underground attacks happened. Now it seems like it's coming back, and you have these small knifing incidents and vans being rammed into pedestrians like we saw today and earlier as well. They seem to be also taking inspiration from what's happening overseas. Like in the Palestinian territories, you see these kind of attacks against Israeli civilians and Israeli security forces quite often. And ISIS itself has invoked the notion that anything can be weaponized, anything as simple as a four-wheeler. So and then they have, it looks like they even if they're not heavily armed, they can inflict mass casualties like we saw in Nice in France in just a truck. So I think they have to come up with a comprehensive plan. The society has to, of course, be calm, but at the same time be highly vigilant. And there has to be greater trust among communities, because that once that breaks down, it becomes very easy for ISIS preachers and hate mongers to be able to attract young people and say, come on, get a life, go and kill someone.
All right, Sreeram Chaulia, Dean of the Jinnah School of International Affairs, thanks for joining us and giving us your insight here on RT Tonight.